One case at ICC that we have been covering for a while is Azerbaijan's attacks on Armenia. And the way to look at it really is it's a more than 100-year campaign. It's actually hundreds of years of Islamic oppression and attacks on a Christian nation. And so there's a more recent attack on a section of Armenia. And then with that, even more recently, there's been a complete blockade by Azerbaijan into this Christian area of Armenia. Again, going on for 100 days. I recently interviewed 3 experts on it and just kind of unpacked the whole thing. So you'll see it all and understand it after you listen to the interview. But as always, God bless you. Thank you for caring about your persecuted brother and sister. And today we are going to have a panel discussion about a region called Artsakh. Artsakh is a part of Armenia, but it's an enclave within Azerbaijan. It was attacked by the Azerbaijanis not too long ago. And then the Russians came in and basically shut down the conflict and were kind of acting as peacekeepers. But then Ukraine happened. And since then, the Azerbaijanis are again up to no good and trying to kill off this part of Armenia called Artsakh. And I wanted to unpack this a little for you. That will give you, first of all, a lot of context to understand all these different seemingly strange names to Americans. And I wanted to give a broader context, and that is that this is really part of a broader war. It's a war from Islam against Christianity, and the participants on the one side are the Azerbaijanis and Turkey, and on the other hand, it's the Christian nation of Armenia. And this goes on for centuries, but in the last century, Turkey attacked Armenia, killed 1 million to 1.5 million Christian Armenians. It was absolutely part of a genocide. It was a jihad. And so for me, I think the simplest way to look at this conflict is to see that this is the latest battle in a long, ongoing war against the Christian nation of Armenia. And what we're seeing right now is a disaster in the making as Azerbaijan has come in and shut off any access or any imports into this region. So the people are without food, without heating. There's no access to vegetables, fruit, meat, etc. Electricity, gasoline is being turned off, etc. That's the context. And with that, we're going to get into the discussion. And in this next segment, I'm going to introduce the panel. So God bless you. Thanks for showing up. All right, everybody, I want to invite you into a panel discussion we're having today. We are going to be talking about Artsakh, which is basically part of Armenia. The issue is Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, and Artsakh. Now, for most people, when I bring those words up, they're usually lost starting with Armenia. But I want to kind of break this down for you. This is a conflict. It's basically the latest battle in a long-running battle. And I want you to understand why you need to listen to this, why this is so important, and why this is so heartbreaking. Okay, so for this, I would say Armenia, the country, was attacked by Turkey in the last century. It was called the Ottoman Empire, but it was Turkey. And that was around 1915, and it was a massive, massive genocide. It was an attack by radical Islam. And they killed 1 to 1.5 million Christians, Armenian Christians. Now, in Armenia, if you're an Armenian or Armenian descent, you know this, but this is basically suppressed in the press. Turkey's constantly attacking any kind of attention over this, blame shifting, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the background. This is a centuries-old radical Islam conflict and jihad. And what we're going to talk today about is just the latest incident. It's the latest thing that's going on. So the same battle in the long genocide, long jihad. In the most recent attack, it started in September 20th, and it really starts with Turkey, I think, as the main player, and I'll let these guys speak. But from my viewpoint, this is Turkey attacking part of Armenia called Artsakh. Artsakh is kind of a surrounded in Azerbaijan, and this is a war by proxy state. It's Turkey backing up Azerbaijan to attack the Christians. So that goes on for a couple months. Russia comes in as the peacekeeper, basically shuts down the conflict. But in the meantime, terrible atrocities. We're seeing all kinds of terrible attacks, beheadings, everything, really horrendous stuff. And then, though, once Ukraine hits, Russia gets diverted. They only have so much manpower and they pull out. And now what's happened is Azerbaijan there's one main corridor, one main highway to get into Artsakh, and that has been shut down. Well, what does that mean? That means all the food, there's no airlift, there's only this one highway, and all the food goes in, all the heating, gasoline for heating and the heating oil, medicine, everything else. So what you're seeing is a region in dire consequences, terrible consequences if something isn't done. Okay. So for me, that is the big picture. And with that, I'm going to introduce the panel. And we have Sarkis Balkian, the ANCA Western Regional Executive Director, Taylin Sahakian, Armenian Bar Association, and Arda Hartunian, Central Board of the Armenian General Benevolent Union. And Arda, I'm going to start with you. I just wanted to ask you for me, really, it all comes down to the victim. What's going on the ground? What's happening to people there? Can you tell us?
Yeah. So first I have to thank you and ICC for holding this panel, and thank you for giving that context, because you took us back to September of 2020 when the attack on Artsakh happened, which ended 44 days later in a pretty devastating loss for the people of Artsakh and for Armenia. But Armenians never give up. I will even take it back just briefly to, early 1920s when this whole problem started, when Stalin arbitrarily gave parts of the Soviet Union to different ethnicities, intentionally causing conflict and strife. So there's a lot of complexity to this, but really for your listeners and viewers, the most important thing to know right now is that there is an ongoing campaign of terror against the 120,000 people living in Artsakh.
Excellent.
And that is most recently is manifesting itself in a 66-day blockade. So what I want everyone to think about is the fact that you don't get any fresh groceries in your fruit store, your, wherever you shop. There's no fresh groceries. There's no medicine. There's no normal kinds of things that we're just used to. Imagine that you don't know if you can get gas for your car. Even worse, yesterday they turned the gas supply, they being Azerbaijan, turned the gas supply on temporarily. Today they shut it off totally. So children have not been going to school. Hospitals cannot do surgeries. The only thing that has happened is that Red Cross vehicles are allowed in and out based on the whims of Azerbaijan, basically. And the irony in all this, it started 66 days ago with a purported environmental protest, where environmental activists were protesting what was going on in Artsakh. And the one question we ask often is, when is the last time Azerbaijan allowed anybody to have a protest?
Yeah.
When is the last time Turkey allowed free protests? So that's how it started under the ruse of a protest, and it has really gone nonstop now for 66 days. So that's really what we're seeing. One of the Azerbaijani officials did make the mistake a couple of weeks ago of taking responsibility for it by saying, but we allow Red Cross vehicles in and out. That is not free passage. So you have an enclave surrounded by hostile forces. And the only road to and from Armenia, which is where all the trade takes place, has been blocked for that long. So it is literally a campaign of terror.
That's excellent. That excellent summary. And thank you for filling in all the cracks with a very big picture I gave. So guys, do you have any firsthand or secondhand accounts? What's happening? Do you hear any of the voices of the victims? What's going on?
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I will say we've heard from some of our contacts there that work at a university, and they've had to kind of periodically shut down, or they can't have calls with us because the internet, in addition to the heat, the internet is intermittently turned off. We've heard problems about wire transfers being able to be sent to them to help them. We've heard families being separated. I mean, this blockade started in the middle of the holiday season in December, and it's been ongoing since then. And a lot of kids were actually in Armenia during December, and they were not able for days and days to return and be connected to their families. So you would see them trying to communicate by, FaceTime or phone with their parents. I mean, when Arda says it's people being encircled, it's also people being separated from their loved ones in a very cruel way.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
I mean, the only thing, and again, thank you, Jeff and ICC for the invitation, but the only thing I would add to what Arda and Talim mentioned is this is part of a decades-long policy by the part of Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, of course, to essentially force Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. It's a campaign that has been ongoing since, at the very least, 1988, when the Armenians demanded expanded rights. At the time, the Soviet Union was still intact. The response of the Soviet Azerbaijani authorities at the time was to commit massacres in Sumgait, to launch a campaign of pogroms in Baku and Girovabad and other parts of Azerbaijan or Soviet Azerbaijan, which led to the displacement of more than 250,000 Armenians. And because of the massacres, because of the pogroms, because of the terror campaign that Azerbaijani authorities at the time, backed by the Soviet authorities, launched, Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh adopted or pursued self-determination and independence in accordance to the laws of the land at the time, which was the Soviet legislation and Soviet constitution, as well as under the principles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this campaign of almost 3.5 decades of essentially pursuing ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. In fact, we have to be thankful, I would say, to the tyrant of Baku, Ilham Aliyev, because he is extremely transparent about his intentions.
Yeah.
And he has consistently said that, the objective of this blockade and all these campaigns is to essentially ethnically cleanse Armenians from Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. So from that perspective, I don't think anyone in the international community or anyone who follows this issue closely has any doubts as to what the plan or what the objective of this blockade is. It is to make life as miserable as possible.
Yep.
In fact, one thing to add is all the schools have been shut down because of the shortage of electricity and gas in Nagorno-Karabakh. So there's about 30,000 children in Artsakh right now, or Nagorno-Karabakh, who can't attend school. So the objective is to make life as miserable as possible so that Armenians either flee Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, which is their ancestral homeland, or the alternative is, this is something Aliyev also mentioned 3 weeks ago, in 2.5 years, he is going to demand that the Russian peacekeepers leave, at which point I think
massacre.
The risk of massacre and genocide is very much real.
Well stated. Thank you for that. That kind of hit my next question. And if you could, guys, anybody, just break apart the role of Turkey and Azerbaijan. So this isn't just a fight with Azerbaijan, and it really delves into Erdogan and who he is and what he's trying to do. Anybody want to comment on that?
Which part? Because it's a complicated yet very simple answer. Yeah. I think what Armenians have achieved in the 100+ years since the genocide that started really late 1800s, but 1915 to 1923, what Armenians have achieved has really irritated Turkey. And as a Christian nation and as a people of the world, the hope had been they would have wiped us off the map. We not only were not wiped off the map, but we have created communities across the globe and thrived in literally every industry we are in.
Yeah.
And so nothing ticks them off more than that. So what is the goal? The goal is to, as Sarkis so well said, is to ethnically cleanse whatever is our historic lands. I mean, what is painful for us and for many of the people, who are watching this, see, even the earthquake, the recent horror that we're seeing, that has taken place on historic Armenian lands. Those were historic Armenian villages.
Wow.
So, and this speaks to our spirit, our soul, and our values. Armenia is providing humanitarian aid and relief to the victims of those earthquakes. So, I think that you ask a very good question. The end game for them is clear. They would like to see us obliterated. The end game for us is to keep doubling down on what we have done and what we do so successfully for the global community. And so that is really, grounded in our faith and our determination and our resilience. And so you have, the three of us here today, but we can have 3,000 of us from different professional fields talking about what you just asked.
Yeah, and it's such a nuanced subject, right? And I think at the very big picture, I'm trying to get, and you guys feel free to push back on this. The way I see this is somewhat of a proxy war. So Azerbaijan has plenty of incentive on their own, but they've got their uncle or their big brother who's backing them up. And I'm not sure they would have moved with the Russians. They would not have moved without Turkey's blessing, right? And so Turkey has sent in ISIS fighters, the Grey Wolves, if you know who those are, but ultra-nationalists from Turkey, they're sending them in. And Erdogan, was elected as a reformer. He quickly showed his stripes, killed off all the opposition or jailed all the opposition. And now he's emperor for life, and he's shown to be a radical Islamist. He has an expansionist mission. And within radical Islam, and this is part of that. So he's happy to cleanse, to finish the job of what was started, et cetera. I think that was my main point. Is that overstated, or do you guys feel that's an accurate telling of the situation?
I mean, I think it is accurate in the sense that they did have the full support in the 2020 war of Azerbaijan, did have the full support of Turkey, and like you said, the foreign fighters that were sent in that war. So I would think yes.
It's a complicated issue, right? Go ahead.
The only thing I would add, we have to, as much as ideology has a lot to do with it, and in fact, Azerbaijan has been, at least since 1994, which was when the first ceasefire agreement was signed. Since then, there's been a systematic campaign of fueling ethnic hatred towards Armenians or Armenophobia.
Yeah.
In fact, this was actually confirmed during an opinion that the International Court of Justice published last year, if I'm not mistaken, but Tallinn can correct me on that one, since she's the expert. But I think the geopolitical context of this is, for the most part, people tend to only look at the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, for example, and how it ties into the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh or the South Caucasus in general. But the reality is Russian-Turkish kind of relations in the context of the Syrian conflict over the past decade has played a huge role in how Russia has postured itself in the context of the ongoing conflict in the South Caucasus. And this is something I do want to stress, which is constantly missed in the international media, as well as, policymakers and politicians who make public statements. There are actually, from a purely international law perspective, there are actually two concurrent conflicts happening right now in the South Caucasus, and there's one culprit, and that culprit is Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey.
Yeah.
The first conflict is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is a conflict of Armenians aspiring for independence and self-determination because the alternative is genocide. The second conflict actually started in May of 2021 when Azerbaijan invaded and has been occupying the sovereign territories of the Republic of Armenia, which is a member state of the United Nations, one of the 193 states. So one is a state-to-state conflict. The other one is a matter of self-determination and independence, which should be protected under the principle of remedial secession, as we have witnessed in South Sudan as well as Kosovo, for example, because the alternative to self-determination and independence is, as we mentioned earlier, potential genocide.
Excellent. Yeah, I've got two last questions, and Taylor, I want to start with you. And this is try to give me a quickie on this. It's so laughable, this question. So, what is Azerbaijan's justification for shutting down the corridor, and why is it laughable?
So their main justification is that there's illegal mining going on, and that there are protesters that are engineering this blockade because they're concerned about the environment. And I think this is very laughable, because there have been a lot of reports of how these individuals, these protesters, have been identified as being either members of the Azerbaijani military or agents of the government. Yeah. And it also has been dispelled because, you have, the people of Artsakh have said, let's send an international monitoring mission to take a look at the mine if there's any concern. And of course, that's not something that they've accepted. If they were really concerned about the environment, they would have done that. But I just want to go back a little bit to a couple of weeks before the blockade, because there was another reason why this justification is laughable, was because a senior Azerbaijani official was quoted in EurasiaNet as saying, what if we were to install a post at the entrance of Lachin and finish this whole process? He said, how can you breathe with no air? So this is an Azerbaijani official saying this a couple of weeks before this comes to pass. So, I don't think we need more evidence about intent and orchestration.
Yeah. And I think Talim's point, I have to say, is, many of us are saying this, the blockade could end tomorrow. That's or right. The next day. Yeah. But then they can start it again. That's the right. Gas gets turned on and off. Electricity gets turned on and off. Internet gets turned on and off. So the inconsistency of relying on basic infrastructure, food, medicine. Yes. When you have someone else controlling that valve, it's a problem. And that's so, right. Really it is part of a longer campaign. And this is where, if the world would just pay attention, they would be able to call him out for the Armenophobic comments and the, comments a few weeks before that Talim just referenced about finishing off what they started. Yeah. That's really the most important thing right now, is just getting the world more broadly to realize that it can happen here today. It can happen with another tyrannical despot somewhere else the next day. Yeah. And then we're down that slippery slope again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're probably getting to the toughest question. And Arda, you're bringing up a point, because the broader context of this thing, and I don't think the strategy was lost on the Azerbaijanis, is that, there is, Ukraine and the broad conflict between Ukraine and Russia and the West and Russia is sucking most of the news, right? And it's very hard to break in on that. So this is such a vital, important thing, but they know when to start an issue like this to starve the people there out. But the question is, what is to be done? For one, what we're going to do our type of thing here, where we try to make the issue known. But besides that, knowing the difficulty of asking this question, what can we do? What can we do? What can listeners do? And what do we do with policy?
Right. So, I'll give a short answer, and then I'll turn to Sarkis, who does more advocacy work and policy work, and of course, Talim also through legal means. But I think, one thing we all have to be realistic about, we're hitting the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, the invasion. Yes. And what's happened? There was a lot of air being spent on it. Has it changed how Russia has acted or reacted? And the answer is no. So that's a little frightening in terms of the world order. So the only thing we can hope is that this compilation of bad guys doing bad things will eventually get the attention of whether it's the UN or other forces that can do something. So I would say the number one thing is getting people aware, informed, educated, and engaged. Whether it's, writing in more things, posting more on social media, raising the world's attention. There is this dearth of coverage in the mainstream media of Artsakh. There isn't as much about, obviously Ukraine.
Yeah.
Not sure what that's yielded, but I think it is I do this professionally. So my thing is, it's a building block approach.
That's
There's
right.
never one,
That's right.
there is never one thing that causes the building to be built. But if we're trying to build a better world and people paying attention to things, it's literally one block at a time. But clearly there are efforts, and I'll turn it to Sarkis, because that's what they do, is advocacy and policy, implementation. So
yeah. And Sarkis, a brief answer. What do you think? Boil it down to policy. What are two main points?
Thank you, Jeff and Arda. I just want to point out that at the end of the 44-day war in 2020, there was a trilateral statement signed by Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And within that statement, the responsibility to secure free passage of people, convoys, goods, has been solely placed on both Russia and Azerbaijan. So in the regards that, the Lachin corridor has been blockaded for the last 66 days, the responsibility lies with Azerbaijan and Russia. And in the context of the Ukraine conflict, I think it's important to also remind policymakers that Russia actually signed a strategic alliance agreement with Azerbaijan 2 days prior to its invasion of Ukraine. Now, in terms of what we need to do from an international community perspective, is because of what I mentioned earlier, Aliyev saying and stating that in 2.5 years' time, he will demand that the Russian peacekeepers leave Artsakh, essentially leaving 120,000 Armenians defenseless. The first step to ensuring the security of that population is to pass a UN Security Council resolution creating an internationally mandated UN peacekeeping mission, which can complement the current Russian peacekeeping.
How do we get to that, Sarkis? What should the people do? I know it's complicated.
So, we to be honest, from ANC Western Region's perspective, because we deal with grassroots advocacy, all of our efforts in terms of pushing local, state, and federal level politicians is to encourage them to put expanded pressure on the Biden administration, because let's be honest, it is ultimately the State Department, USAID, the US mission to the United Nations, and the Biden administration who has the toolbox to take immediate action to not only end the blockade, but also hold, for example, the Aliyev regime accountable under, for example, the Magnitsky Act, sanctioning specific individuals, their crimes against humanity and war crimes due to the 2020 war and the continuation with this blockade. And then the U.S. has the ability to, introduce a resolution at the UN Security Council as a permanent member of the UN, to establish a UN mission in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. So I think all of our efforts has been to garner, support by the politicians who have worked with the Armenians and with Armenian organizations, not only ANCA, but also Armenian Assembly, AGBU, and Armenian Bar Association, and others, to put additional pressure on the Biden administration to act. Basically.
And to act means to give UN support to a peacekeeping force. Is that the bottom line?
It doesn't have to be a, U.S.
What do we want people to call and ask for?
International peacekeeping mission that complements the current existing peacekeepers on the ground.
Absolutely. So appreciate that. And guys, if we don't do it, you all know, I'm speaking to the listeners, if we don't do this, and these guys have been saying it, the leader of Azerbaijan, they have been very clear about what they're going to do. They had a gun put to their head where they had to stop their activities and their killing. And at the time, they said very clearly, and since have said, we're going to come back and finish the job. And so part of that can be mass starvation or death by cold. But we've got a tremendous disaster. This is really, it's not just geopolitics. It's a religious war, too, and a long running one. So people call your legislators, ask them and tell them to put pressure on the Biden administration to get in and to solve the situation in Artsakh and Armenia. So bless you guys. So appreciate your being on today and for all the work you do. And with that, we're going to sign off, and I thank you.